All right, shall we get started? Do we have any more folks kind of trickling in?
I think we're probably good to get going. I'll admit as folks come along.
All right, well, as folks come in, they can just stay tuned. So, hi everybody. My name, oh, hold on, I'm getting interesting. It looks like there may be another link, another Zoom link. I just got a text from my mom. She'll figure it out. My name is Noah Mertz. I am an organizer with Equal Justice in Needham, which is a group of residents in Needham who are committed to working toward racial equity and socioeconomic equity and justice in our town. And we're interested in anything and everything that will move Needham toward a more equal and just existence in the world. And so we've been undertaking a lot of various efforts. We kind of grew out of the George Floyd uprisings over summer 2020. And one of the first things that we started looking into were the stories of a lot of people of color in Needham who have experienced racial profiling in various businesses in town. And one of these stories was from Marvin Henry, who is a Black man who works as a massage therapist in Needham and was had a really horrible story of being handcuffed by Needham police on allegations of shoplifting or an accusation of shoplifting that was not true. And so we've been doing what we can to get justice for Mr. Henry. So tonight we'll be talking about what's basically been going on since the Marvin Henry incident in January 2020. We're now about over a year since then, and a lot has happened. There are currently 3 reports that are out in Needham, and tonight we're going to be talking about all 3 of them and kind of making sense of all the information that we have available to us. The first report that we'll be hearing about is Equal Justice in Needham's Public Safety Report Part 2, which is a thorough analysis of data that we received from the Needham Police Department in response to a public records request that we submitted in fall of 2020. And we'll be hearing from Rebecca Weber and Smriti Rao, who were 2 of the major writers and analysts of that report. We'll also be hearing from Stephanie Hartung, who is a professor at Northeastern, who will be going over the recently released Tidwell Report, which was the outcome of the independent investigation undertaken by Natasha Tidwell for the town. There are 2 drafts of that report, an original and then a second draft, and we're going to be looking into what changed from one to the next and sort of the outcomes of all of this. And then in addition to that, the third report is the internal affairs investigation, the Needham Police Department internal affairs investigation. So Stephanie will also be talking about that. So to introduce Equal Justice in Needham's report a little bit, this was put together by a bunch of Needham residents, a bunch of members, or not members, but people who do work with Equal Justice in Needham. And it really is a civilian effort. It is the public data that we requested. We did pay over $1,000 to get this data on things like handcuffing and various things that Smriti and Rebecca will talk about. Rebecca Weber has a master's degree from MIT in behavioral economics and works in innovation. And Smriti Rao is a professor of economics at Assumption College in Worcester, Mass. Stephanie Hartung has been really busy lately with her involvement in the Innocence Project, which has been seeing great success in the exoneration of Sean Ellis, which is a story that we've been following for a while. So I believe that I have covered everything here. There are a couple a couple links that John is going to put in the chat right now to all of the reports that I just mentioned. I know it's a lot. It's kind of hard to sort through things, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better handle of all of the different information that's available right now. And there will also be including all of the data from our public records requests. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Weber.
Thank you, Noah. Yes, so in the chat is a link to the report that we've put together, as well as the data that went into the report. And I kind of want to start with how I feel about being here tonight and seeing that we have a really good turnout for this conversation. I feel really glad that so many people are here and want to talk about the policing data in Needham. It's really important to me that we kind of look at what the facts are in our town and be able to see where there's opportunities for us to be better as a town. I was thinking about this whole feedback as a gift concept and how we need to know what the truth is so that we can see where there are problems, where there aren't problems, what we need to do. And I'm a little emotional about it today because of what's been happening with the Tidwell Report this week. And if anyone was at the select board meeting about it on Monday, it was a defensive tone. It was not a let me learn from my mistakes kind of tone. And I really feel like we have a great opportunity here to understand what's going on so that we can intelligently, have conversations as a town about where we want to improve. So anyway, with that, first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this data is and how we got it and where we got it. So it's public. We did a public records request as, allowed to do by law, to ask for policing data. As Noah said, it took, like $1,200. And the reason for that is because it was very time intensive for the police department to get us this data, because they don't really keep the data in a particularly accessible way or regularly review it. So you can see in the appendix of the report, the actual questions that we asked them, but it's things like, how often do we handcuff people and what's the race of people we handcuff? How often do school resource officers have interactions with students that require reporting and what's the race of those students? How many weapons do we have and what are they? Like those sorts of questions. And the one of the really big things that we found that I think was the most relevant to us is just, this was incredibly hard work for the police department to get back to us. It took 15 hours to answer that question about handcuffing because the officer had to literally manually read every report ever for the past 3 years. That was the time frame we gave them to understand, well, did we handcuff, yes or no? Because we're not really kind of keeping track of that. So that was really our first theme was one around oversight and data. And the importance of, or the sort of status quo of data being pretty inaccessible, time intensive, manual, and so forth. It is pretty notable that the police do have a bias policy, an anti-bias policy that says that they are required to do an annual racial bias review, but they were not able to give us said annual racial bias review. So it doesn't seem that it actually has been happening. And so this oversight theme was pretty important. The second theme, which Mertz will go into in a lot of detail, is where we do see race-based disparities in policing outcomes. So we looked at a wide variety of policing outcomes, things like offenses with criminal charges sought, handcuffing, arrests, and so on. And in all cases, we saw a very high percentage of Black and as well as Hispanic individuals having those interactions, much higher than the percent of, the way residents fallout for sure. And so I think that raises some, just, again, it's data. We need to look into why is this happening, where are there problems, and so forth. Lastly, we reviewed policies, training, and staffing, and we found some areas that we feel could really use some modernization to be in line with sort of 21st century best practices, the sort of norms and values of the community and so forth. In particular, these were around use of force and mental health. With that, Smriti is going to go into the tables, and then I'll be back to go through some elements of the report itself.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Smriti Rao, and I have lived in Needham for the last 13 years. I am a professor of economics as my day job. And, my kids I had only one baby when I moved in here, and now I have two, and they're 9 and 14. And so I've got to say that while a lot of my research is on issues of public policy, it has largely been directed at India. And you can hear the 9-year-old. 1 second. Actually, not right now. Sorry. Okay. It was only in the last 6 months that I began to think about public policy here in Needham. My work has primarily been on India up to this point. I'm a social scientist, and I've obviously done a lot of work in the area of public policy and governance and development. And the first thing you do is you ask, hey, where's the data? And can we break the data down, and let's see what we can learn, right? And we're always very cautious about data, and it needs to be interpreted, and you need context. But that's like basic first principles, basic good governance. So the policing issue comes up, and, thanks to COVID, I guess, I had a little extra time. And, I think like many of us, because I noticed once I started getting on these phone calls with other people that all of us had the same question. Our question was, where's the data? You go on the website, there's nothing, right? There's no reports. I go to the school committee, there's lots of data about schooling. You go to the planning board, there's lots of data about housing. You go to, the public health department, a lot of data about public health in Needham. But there's this black hole when it comes to policing. And the only way we could get any answers to our questions were to email Kate, and then Kate would email the chief. And so this just seemed, your antennae go up when there's a black hole like that. You kind of like, wait a second, what's happening here? So there were a whole bunch of people who were interested in this issue, and, EJ informed out of some of these concerns. And of course, we decided to undertake this public records request enterprise. And Rebecca primarily shepherded the PRR process, but once the data arrived, again, I got back involved. Mostly just out of curiosity. It was just curiosity, right? I would say that I think we've done some really good work. I think we worked really hard on this and, kind of used a lot of our spare time. And what I am sort of a little bit heartbroken about is not so much that the black hole existed at the level of the data, although I think we should fix that, obviously, but that once we completed the report and we sent it out, we heard nothing from anyone, right? I thought our select board wishes to be inclusive. I thought we are in a participatory democracy. I hold up the US sometimes as a model for India. And I thought, you do something like this and you're invited to start a conversation. You are invited to come and speak and share what you have learned. That is not, basically we've been met with silence. So I guess, if they don't want to hear what we've learned, I guess we hope that you do. And so that's sort of the point of sharing this with you. All right. So, again, we have to sort of cobble together our understanding of the data because there isn't a nice, neat explainer for residents who want to learn about the categories the police use. So clearly there are interactions of different levels of intensity and severity between police and civilians. I should probably maximize my screen, right? And there is a federally supported initiative called the Police Data Initiative that Needham is not a part of. Other towns in Massachusetts are. And I'm not sure why Needham is not a part of it, but we should be. And we should be working really hard on transparency of this very basic kind. So turning to the baseline, again, I think the absolute numbers you're going to see are going to be enough. But if you did want to try to compare with the population at large, as you know, race and ethnicity are treated as two different categories in the census. So what we know is that about 13% of the Needham population is non-white, about 15% of the Metro West area. And we know that the Hispanic population, which is a cross-cutting category in the census, is about 3% in Needham, and it's a little bit higher in the Metro West area, but not very much. So Needham is pretty representative of the larger Metro West area. And so if you construct a sort of maximal people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color category, it would be 16%. A maximal Black and Hispanic share would be 7%. So just keep those in your mind as baselines that you can compare these numbers against. So, I mean, we have a lot of different data in there, so we wanted to pick and choose a couple that might stand out. And so, I want to focus today on three that we think are sort of the most intense forms of interactions between civilians and the police in Needham, and the ones that have the most lasting consequences. So I'm gonna, start with handcuffs. And handcuffs, Rebecca will talk more about the way the handcuffing is dealt with in the current use of force policy in Needham. But I think you would agree that if you were handcuffed in public by the police as a Needham resident, you would not consider that to be a minor inconvenience, especially if you were handcuffed in public, your neighbors are walking past you, your employers are walking past you. I don't think you would consider that a minor inconvenience, right? I certainly thought, in my ignorance, that this was a use of force because handcuffs, right? So anyway, so it turns out we handcuff a lot of people in Needham, over 100 a year. And this adds up to about 400 over the last 3 years, a little more. And as you can see, 35% of those are BIPOC, and of those 32% are Black and Hispanic. Again, remember that 7% number in your mind, 35%, that's more than a third, right, are BIPOC. And then again, we'll come back to handcuffs in a little while. Offenses for which criminal charges are sought. Again, we had to unpack some of this stuff, and Stephanie was very helpful in doing so. But people can be charged with criminal offenses that have a criminal charge, and some of those might be summons, some of those might be arrests. And we don't have data on this, but it would be fascinating to see how many are dismissed. And whether the folks whose arrests and charges are dismissed are Black and Hispanic or not. So, but we don't have that data. So here is where you see a really strikingly high share, almost half in a pandemic year when numbers were down, almost half of all people against whom offenses with a criminal charge were sought were people of BIPOC, and 41% were Black and Hispanic, 41%. And then with arrests, it's 35% in 2019-20, 31% Black and Hispanic. I'm happy to take questions later, right? So I want to just break down the handcuffs for a second. And I just what I want to show you here is the bottom two rows, which is the split of Black and Hispanic. Now they can overlap. So this is not a perfect split. So there can be some folks who are both Black and Hispanic. What I want you to notice is obviously there's a very high Black share, given that 3% or 4% of the Metro West population is Black. Look at that Hispanic share. Look at how it's risen over the years, right? So these are communities of color, and both of these communities of color being disproportionately represented in this data. So I just want you to note those shares. And then turning to handcuffs by reason, which was quite fascinating. Many of the handcuffs, the majority of those who are handcuffed are because of arrests or summons that are outstanding. There's a small percentage who are due to mental health. We just wanted to highlight, and we did so in the report, these two smaller categories, right? They're very small categories, but they're very informative, because protective custody is when you arrest somebody for their own safety, for example, if they're drunk, intoxicated. And officer safety is when officers perceive a threat, and therefore they handcuff you. And what is striking, given everything we know about the way that threat perception works, is that 44% of those who were handcuffed because the officer felt threatened were once again BIPOC. And again, a vast majority of those are Black and Hispanic, right? So, this data by itself is just indicative but I think it's indicative of some pretty important and significant things that we should explore further as a town, and that the select board should be very interested in learning more about. And last but not least is there's actually one more table, but this is almost at the end. The use of force, what the Needham police formally defines as the use of force. They have a compliance technique where they use hands, legs, or knees to try to subdue a person. And then they can use tasers. They have some other non-lethal weapons. They have batons, and they have drawn a gun, although not shot it. Apparently, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, a few times over the years, but that's not very common. But again, you know, all use of force, the bypass share is 27%, but when it comes to the use of tasers, batons, non-lethal 40Ms, that percentage jumps up to 40. So again, you know, you look at the more severe forms of interaction, the more intense forms of interactions with the police, and you see a much higher representation of people of color and Black and Hispanic people in particular. And again, these are not trivial percentages. These are quite high, right? We're talking almost half. So that's quite a lot, between a third and a half in most cases. And then the last is something that Rebecca already mentioned. This data was not given to us by date. It was a little bit hard to disaggregate for various reasons. So we dropped, it included some people who were over 20. I'm not sure why. So we dropped it, dropped those who were over 20 and just kept those under 20 in our data. And we just combined all 3 years because we couldn't split it out. And what you see here are interactions reported by school resource officers that they had to report. And presumably, since these are folks under 20, I assume they're students, but we don't know for sure. And again, what I want you to note, and here there's no ambiguity that these are non-residents or these are strangers. We know exactly what the Black share of the Needham Public Schools students are, and it's about 2%, right? We know exactly what that share is. And compared to that share of the student body, you see interactions overall are about 11% Black. But what's fascinating is if you look at the result, you know, the way outcomes of the interactions were classified, I'm assuming juvenile trouble is the least intense, the least consequences, right? And there we see only 9% Black. Well, 9% Black is still a lot compared to 2% of the student body population. And look at the percentage for interactions that resulted in charges, citations, and arrests. That's 23. And interactions that resulted in school discipline, that's 16. So you see, again, the pattern here is the more severe, the more intense, the more consequential the interaction with the police, the more this number jumps up. And again, you know, I just don't understand why the police are not interested in learning this about themselves and understanding what's going on. I don't understand why the select board is not interested in this data, is not dying to figure out what's going on. So the silence just is perplexing to me, quite honestly, as a resident of Needham and somebody who loves this town. And so I think I am basically done. And so I'm just gonna turn it back to Rebecca.
Thank you, Smriti. I'm going to try to share my screen and pull up the report. So can folks see that? Let's see. Yeah, can you see this report?
You're good,
here?
Rebecca.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So this is the report that we linked to in the chat, or if you go to Equal Justice Needham, it's right on the front page. And you'll find the tables that Smriti showed in here as well. I just wanted to highlight some of the other areas that we thought were pretty important. So we reviewed about 25 or so NPD policies, and we noted a number of them that seemed concerning and that we think that many of you would find concerning if you read them as well. One of them is the use of force policy. As Smriti noted, one thing that jumps out is that handcuffing is not considered a use of force, which again doesn't seem to align with sort of the lived understanding of what force is. And another thing in the use of force policy is the idea that it mentions de-escalation, and it's like one standalone sentence that's completely not tied with the rest of the document, like someone just sort of added in after the fact. I think when many people I've had conversations with in town, we think about what we want forceful interactions to be like. We want, de-escalation first. We want safety to be paramount, safety of all people in an interaction. And those things are not found in our use of force policy. Safety is only mentioned in the context of officer safety. It was mentioned once in the context of victim safety in a domestic violence situation. But the idea that anyone in a police interaction deserves to be safe and to survive that interaction and to emotionally come out non-traumatized on the other side, it's really nowhere to be found. So that was pretty striking. Another thing that jumped out to me, the topic of mental health is something that's really important to me, and I know is very important to people in town. This was a very big topic at town meeting when we last summer when we were discussing policing. Most of the conversation actually was about mental health, and the police department has talked about the importance of mental health in their work. With that as context, it was concerning how little there really is around mental health. The policy was awkwardly titled "Handling the Mentally Ill," and it kind of didn't get better from there. It did not talk about how to ensure the safety of someone who might be acting suicidally or in an unusual manner. Training wise, there's only one training program on mental health that all officers receive. Only 20% of officers receive crisis training, and so forth. So kind of on this whole topic, it really appears in aggregate that while everyone recognizes that mental health is important, we're really kind of outstripping, what we're putting into it from a town point of view and a public safety point of view. And so that was definitely something of concern. So there's a number of policies here that we kind of go into some detail as to opportunities for potential improvement. Training, we went through the training both for the NPD as well as what happens at the academy, and just looking at kind of where time is spent. There's much more time spent on firearms, tasers, and so forth, and things like de-escalation, bias, mental health. Now, if you give people guns, you probably want them to be trained on the guns. So I don't think, that's necessarily the problem, but it raises these questions of, if we're spending, all of our time training weapons, does everyone need to have a weapon? If we're saying mental health is so important, why aren't we seeing that in terms of the resourcing that we're putting into that? And maybe mental health doesn't belong in the police department. There's many people asking questions about that, but I think that's the kind of thing that we see in this data. And so you can see there's lots of detail on that as well. Staffing was another topic that we went into. We noted that out of all of the police officers and dispatchers, there are only 2 who are BIPOC. And we also noted quite a large number of individuals who appear to be related based on sharing uncommon last names. We do know that Chief Schlittler has 2 relatives in the department as well. And that raised concern in our minds, both because of the lack of diversity and also because of just concerns with trying to, be a manager of a relative or to kind of have oversight of a relative, just kind of, raises concerns if you're trying to do something like do an internal investigation of someone or just kind of point out where someone's behavior might need to change. So those are some of the details in the report. I just really wanted to kind of scroll through this and show you all what's in here so that you can see where you might want to dive further in. I know it looks long. I know it looks like a big meaty report, but really the beginning is a summary The end is an appendix, so it's not too overwhelming, I promise. And yeah, so at the end here, we have let me show you just the appendices, some more detail on mental health, some more detail on metrics. The recommendations overall really come down to 3 areas, which is transparency, accountability, and modernization. Smriti talked about this too. The idea of data that is accessible, that is a dashboard, that doesn't require $1,200, 4 months, and 5 people to go through, just seems like it should be a baseline for all of us. With that accountability, how do we have oversight that looks at this data and says, kind of seems concerning. We should probably dig into why these things are and to see what's really going on here. And maybe in some cases, we'll find that there's a good explanation. And in other cases, we are likely to find that there isn't a good explanation and some sort of change is warranted. So how do we have that oversight where someone's going to use this feedback as an opportunity to be better? And lastly, this idea of modernization of policies and training. Honestly, a lot of these policies had typos and formatting errors and and nothing had a glossary, which really just looked like no one has ever really, maybe, externally, right? That no one reads these. And they should be read, right? They should be modern and up to date. And they should be in line with the best research that's out there academically, and they should be in line with our values as people in a town. And so how do we kind of bring all these things into the light to make all of these things happen? That's not to say that all of the, it's not to say necessarily everything, but there's clearly opportunity here. And we can use this as a baseline to have honest, data-driven conversations about all of it. Here's the appendix. So this is the time that it took the NPD to procure the data. Again, because it was extremely manual, that's why it took so long. This was actually after having worked through with the department. This was our second request. The first request wasn't sort of worded correctly to be as easy as possible. We talked to the officer to find out, we kind of dug into what IT systems they use and what sort of reporting isn't possible. I was literally reading manuals of their IT systems to try to figure out which questions would be the most doable to minimize the amount of time spent. And it still was very time intensive. So this was round 2. And then we have our original PRR request. So you can see the exact questions that we asked for. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Stephanie to talk about other data and reports that are going on related to this.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks everybody. And first, I just want to commend the authors, the EJN authors who have, it's as you all just saw, it's incredible the work that they've done as volunteers and citizens who have, put in their time to just volunteer all these hours to put together this amazing report involving both data collection, analysis, and reporting at an incredibly high level, sophisticated level. So I think that the takeaways, the big takeaways that were just mentioned by Smriti and Rebecca are actually highlighted in the Marvin Henry case. And so I think it's appropriate that we're talking about that today in conjunction with this incredibly important report. And particularly the 2 themes that are so prevalent in the Marvin Henry case are, oversight and accountability, and then the need for it here in Needham and with Needham PD as elsewhere, and also the racial disparities that have just been so clearly laid out by Smriti and Rebecca. And I'll say in terms of the accountability side, I think what Rebecca mentioned in terms of how many hours it took the police department to come up with these numbers, it shows that these are not things they're tracking themselves, that they're not evaluating their own work on these fronts, and we know that that's problematic. As far as racial disparities, unfortunately, the disparities that Rebecca and Smriti just laid out they're not unusual. They're in line with national trends and national data that we're aware of, but it should nonetheless be eye-opening for those of us who live in Needham and anyone who might think that it doesn't happen here and that somehow our police department or our town is exempt from these realities, and the data shows that that we're not. So I want to make that point first. So, you know, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the Tidwell Report and to put it in a context from a legal perspective. And, you know, I'll start by saying it's a 45-page report. We've seen 2 different versions that are posted. We don't know exactly why one was amended, and some significant changes were made 10 days apart. There's also been an internal investigation report by Internal Affairs by NPD. So it's a lot of information, a lot of detail, and certainly not something we could go through comprehensively tonight in the time that we have. But I do want to highlight some particular aspects of the report that are important, and especially for those of us who were at the select board meeting on Monday night and heard the presentation there. You know, it's problematic for a number of reasons that have already been alluded to. One, none of us had access to the report at the time of that presentation. And 2, by far the result of the conclusion of the report that was highlighted most prominently by the select board was this finding that there was an insufficient basis to show that racial bias motivated the officers' decisions. And that was primarily what was discussed. But actually, when you go through the reports, there's a lot more significant findings to unpack and discuss. So I want to focus on some of those tonight. And I think most of you who are here are pretty familiar with the case from news reporting, but I'll just very briefly go over the basic kind of primarily undisputed facts for everyone to be aware of. This is an incident that happened on January 25th of 2020 in the afternoon at CVS at Needham Heights. And a CVS employee called Needham police, reported that there was a Black man and woman inside CVS who were participating in an ongoing shoplifting incident. The caller reported that these 2 had been involved in shoplifting incidents in the past, and gave a little bit of an MO of what they typically do, which is fill 2 carts full of items, pay for 1 or 2 items, and then leave with the rest of the unpaid items in a full cart. So this was all described over the phone. The man in this duo was described as being a large Black man wearing a gray hoodie. And soon after, several officers arrived on the scene. Mr. Henry, we know, then was detained down the street. He exited CVS through the Highland Avenue door and then was detained in front of Starbucks where he had parked his car. And it was Officer Schlittler who initially detained him. And then we know that Mr. Henry was pat searched, handcuffed immediately after he was detained, and he was detained for over 30 minutes. And it wasn't until much later that it was determined that there was a second Black man and a Black woman also in CVS, all of this verified through video surveillance at CVS, and that the other man perfectly matched the description given. He was a very large man, he was wearing a gray hoodie, he left within seconds of Mr. Henry, and all of this is verified on the video. So as far as the important findings from the Tidwell report, and I guess before I go into these, just one more word about the nature of this report. It's certainly important and significant, and I will commend the authors of the report for having gone through a very thorough factual investigation. But we should recognize that this was not written by a judge. It's not binding authority. It's not part of Mr. Henry's civil rights case that he is bringing against the town of Needham and the police department. And it has no bearing, no legal bearing on that case. Even so, you know, the findings and the process of that investigation are important. So some of the things that were not emphasized at the select board meeting, number one, the Tidwell report very clearly concluded that while it did find that the officers had reasonable suspicion, which is the legal standard for the initial detention of Mr. Henry, that Officer Schlittler was not, he was not following the law or Needham policy when he pat frisked Mr. Henry immediately following the detention. So that wasn't fully addressed or discussed at the select board meeting, but that's troubling, and especially in light of the statistics that we've just heard from the EJN report. A second point that's highlighted in the Tidwell report, which is really important as well, I think, in evaluating the validity of the racial bias finding especially, is that the officers failed to consider overwhelming, they don't use the word overwhelming, that's my word, but they failed to consider significant evidence of innocence and as they were initially investigating this case. And just to give you some of the examples that were highlighted in the report, and again, this is the Tidwell report's findings, that the clothing and physical description did not match, that Mr. Henry produced a receipt that verified that what he had just purchased was paid for. He had it with him. He had undisputable proof. The surveillance video, which was supposedly viewed that day, clearly shows that there were two separate individuals, one who matched the description of the shoplifter suspect and the other who did not. All of those things were not taken into account in any meaningful way as the officers held Mr. Henry for 30 minutes. The report also notes that even the MO described in the call was inconsistent with Mr. Henry being parked in front of Starbucks. If you're going to go in and run out of a store with a cart full of unpaid items, you're not going to park down the street where you have to wait at a light to cross the street with a grocery cart full of merchandise. It doesn't make any sense. The officers seemed not to consider that. Also, the fact that Mr. Henry had stopped and ordered his lunch prior to entering CVS, and he told the officers that, and they had proof of that he had his lunch with him. He had made his order, then he went to CVS, then he came back and picked it up, and then he was detained by Officer Schlittler. They didn't take that into account. And finally, that he worked right across the street, and it would be unusual to decide to commit a crime repeatedly directly across from where you work. So there were all kinds of affirmative pieces of evidence that got largely ignored, and that's troubling, again, especially in light of the data that we've just heard. Another troubling finding in the report is that the Needham PD's own internal investigation was inadequate. And this, I think, relates to the second theme that Rebecca just highlighted, which is that there's a need for more external oversight of police practices and policies. It's not realistic to expect an internal investigation to be truly objective. And here there are indications that it wasn't. And specifically, the Tidwell report says that the internal affairs investigation did not adequately address the factual inconsistencies that were apparent when they revisited the evidence. And there are a number of examples of this, but the primary one is that, and this is really significant, that the basis for the initial detention of Mr. Henry is that the officers claimed that the CVS employee had identified him. Identify is a legal term that means had definitively stated that is the person who committed the crime. And the follow-up investigation conducted by the Tidwell team revealed that that is not supported by the evidence. It's not supported by the video recordings, the video surveillance from CVS store. It's not supported by the officers' own statements that contradict each other in terms of timing in places. And it's also not supported by the CVS employees' own version of events. So that was the kind of linchpin to the initial finding that it was reasonable to stop Mr. Henry, was because he was supposedly identified. And now that's been significantly undermined in the report. So that's important. Finally, the report found, and this is significant for a number of reasons, but the report found that the Needham police, members of the Needham Police Department consistently downplayed or minimized the harm caused to Mr. Henry, and almost took on the phrase used was no harm, no foul attitude during their interviews about the incident. And in fact, the initial version of the Tidwell report that was filed on March 1st included a lengthy conclusion that has a lot of impactful language about Needham's police department's failure to recognize this, the harm caused by this kind of detention. And that entire paragraph was then removed in the second report that was filed on March 11th. So it's unclear why that paragraph was removed, but again, important in understanding the kind of context of the report as a whole. And so I think, the last point I'll make about this, and then I know that we want to allow time for questions, but I think when you look at all of these inconsistencies that are pointed out in the Tidwell report, it's troubling, if not outright just baffling and surprising to me that the ultimate conclusion of no racial bias was reached. And especially when you consider what a low standard they were applying. So the standard used in the report was a preponderance of the evidence, which is the lowest legal standard that exists. And it means that it's used in civil cases, not criminal. And criminal, as you know, is beyond a reasonable doubt, much higher level of proof required. But in a civil case, a preponderance just means something is more likely than not. And so the Tidwell investigators ultimately concluded that they could not say it was more likely than not than racial bias influenced the officers' decisions or motivated their decisions. As I said, I find it particularly troubling and unsupported by the rest of the information in their own report, especially that when you consider that every single detail provided about the suspect did not match Mr. Henry, not a single detail except for his race. That was the only thing that was verified. We know that the identification didn't happen in the way the officers said that it did. And we know that these officers made every inference against Mr. Henry's innocence in spite of the factual evidence that showed that supported that. And so what's left is a group of officers drawing inferences against a Black man that lead toward guilt instead of overwhelming evidence of innocence. So there's more I could say. I want to allow, we only have 10 minutes left, so I definitely want to allow time for questions and comments, but I would encourage everyone to take the time to read the Tidwell report and the internal affairs report that are all posted on the Needham website if you want some more detailed information and want to see some of these things for yourselves. And I think I'll turn it back to Noah to conclude.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you also to Rebecca and Smriti. Thank you for all of the super thorough overviews of all of this information that's been bouncing around. At this point, I would love it. I think it's possible for Smriti for you to share. Yes, great. So it does, I think, bear reading. This final paragraph from the original draft of the Tidwell report, which again was supposed to be independent, and as far as we know, what happened between the first and the second report, the drafts of this report, was that the select board did confer with Tidwell, and what we see is that in the second report, this conclusive paragraph is missing. So I'm just going to read this out. More than once during our interviews of NPD officers, we heard words to the effect of Mr. Henry wasn't charged, so, as if to infer that his release from arrest without further law enforcement involvement was essentially no harm, no foul. It is similarly tempting for others to casually encapsulate Mr. Henry's experience with Needham Police Department as his having been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or to minimize as a petty indignity what he endured. A roughly 30-minute detention in handcuffs on a public street in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, a mere 2 blocks from his workplace. These seizures, the Terry court noted, this is referencing a prior lawsuit that Tidwell is referencing, represent a serious intrusion upon the sanctity of the person, which may inflict a great indignity and arouse strong resentment, and it is not to be undertaken lightly. As we are all too aware from recent events, these encounters can also have tragic consequences for people of color, Black men in particular. Fortunately, that was avoided here. Our hope is that Mr. Henry's experience will serve as an impetus for greater awareness of the issues raised in this matter. Implementation of the policy and procedural modifications we submitted above, and an overdue acknowledgement of the harm caused to Mr. Henry. Thank you, Smriti. So the question in my mind, and in a lot of people's minds, is what about this paragraph bears removal? From that first original draft to the second draft, what about this paragraph does not ring true? What about this is our town not ready to acknowledge and stand behind? I think there are some serious concerns about the influence of the select board over this entire process and the narrative that they're trying to control of what this report actually says. If you just look at the select board presentation from this past Monday, there was no question and answer, which of course is the standard procedure for these sorts of meetings. But it was a very reminiscent of the Bill Barr situation. The information was cherry picked. The town's lawyer, Tidwell herself, was not present. The town's lawyer presented the findings of this report, cherry picking specific points that would effectively exonerate the police and therefore the select board as well as the primary oversight of the police. I think this message of neither side did anything wrong. The select board repeatedly stated that Marvin Henry was, of course, not to blame. Now, the first thing that the lawyer said, or one of the first things that the town's lawyer said was, and I quote, "the shoplifting incident involving Mr. Henry." There was no shoplifting incident involving Mr. Henry. We have to be very careful about the way that we present the reality of the situation. And the town saying that they're, of course, neither side did anything wrong is dangerous, because what we'll continue to see is this pattern, a status quo of racial profiling, of stop and frisk and handcuff in our town that continue to disproportionately affect BIPOC people, primarily Black and Hispanic people. Additionally, it's really important to note that the data, if we're putting all of this together, the report that Rebecca and Smriti went over at the beginning, and then this independent investigation report, and also the internal affairs report from the police, if we put all of this together, the data points to this not being an isolated incident. We know that Marvin Henry is not the only person who has been handcuffed by people, by the Needham Police Department. And we can only guess as to what other stories are out there. And we're incredibly grateful to Marvin for his bravery in coming forward to tell his story. Because if he hadn't, then I have very little confidence that anything would be changing anytime soon in our policing in town. So I think we need to be thinking about this as a pattern and a sort of systemic dimension to these things. And of course, these investigations focus very narrowly on the one incident and proving through various legalese processes. It can't be proven that racial bias was an element and therefore exoneration. mean, if we step away from the processes as established right now, we have to just ask ourselves the basic question: is this a just process? Is this how we want to seek justice for these things that are going on in our town? I am not satisfied with this as it is currently, I can certainly say. So just to reiterate what Rebecca mentioned, there are 3 things that we're hoping to see here. We need external oversight, we need accountability, and we need to update our use of force, mental health, and other policies in town. Another thing I do want to mention is, so I hung out with Marvin a little bit last night outside, COVID distance and everything, and he's been deeply shaken by the Tidwell report that came out, and the select board's presentation of it in particular. The way that they cherry picked and characterized the findings to exonerate themselves. And he's been very, very shaken by this. And I was always told that, if you wrong someone, you need to make it right. We talk about restorative justice and transformative justice now. The select board mentioned that they have formally apologized to Mr. Henry. Marvin told me last night that no one has apologized to him personally. He has not received that apology. It hasn't gone through to him. So I don't know who the select board is apologizing to the public, whatever, but Marvin does not feel like it has gotten through to him yet. And I think that there's a lot of healing and a lot of justice that is yet to be sought. One thing that the chief mentioned at the select board meeting on Monday that I was really happy to hear is that he is willing to do whatever is necessary to get our police department to where it needs to be. And I would hope that everyone here on this call and everyone in our community can help to hold him to that. And that is what we are asking of you tonight. So thank you, everybody. We are now gonna, I know it's 7:30 on the dot right now, but I would like to transition over to Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, and or maybe a better way would be for me to switch to gallery view here. Let's see. So if you have a question, if you could please raise your hand with the raise your hand function, or unmute yourself and jump in. You can also ask some questions in the chat if you would like. Let's see. We have several screens here, so I can't see everyone at once. So I think
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna, I can see it. So the question that I've seen the most, Noah, is where do we go from here? What are next steps? The next step is all of you. I agree with Eric, your comment that, we have a good solid government. It doesn't seem like there seems like there's something not working here now. And it seems to me that we, the people, need to show that we care about this. And that's why I'm really happy that so many people showed up to this call tonight. We did send the report to the NPD, to the select board. We sent it before it was published, after it was published. And like Smriti said, why has it been crickets? And the only answer I can come up with is not enough people have said that they care. And so please, everyone on the, I think it's in your hands. We need to show that this isn't just a handful of, troublemakers, like the way that I think perhaps we're being seen. We're not trying to cause, well, it's good trouble, right? It's raising awareness of facts, and we shouldn't be afraid of facts. We should embrace them and learn from them and get better. And I think if you all show that you care, I think that's where the next steps come from. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone else has another answer about, we are continuing to be excited and open for the property of working in the prospect of working together toward things like, what would oversight look like? What would a data dashboard look like? Et cetera.
Does any of our other speakers have something to add?
No, I just see a hand though. No, I don't know if you can't
Oh.
see it.
I would just add quickly that we do have an election coming up on April 13th. And frankly, what I want to see, I mean, the goal of EJN is to pursue real change in town, systemic change in town, so that we cut these cycles off so they stop happening. If the current people in power are going to perpetuate a status quo and handle the situation in this way, then I'm excited to see some other folks on the ballot be elected. VJ, I see a hand there.
Yeah, so I had a quick question. I'm not a data scientist, obviously, but I don't really know, like, personally how to like look at the data because I don't know anything about sample sizes and margins of error and stuff like that. But with the size of the data set for like arrest, for example, how can we like determine whether or not it's statistically significant, the difference between the metro, the region that we live in and the town in terms of BIPOC?
So I can take that. So we didn't try. We didn't do that. All we did are just simple percentages. And our argument is this is not our job as unpaid volunteer citizens, right? It's the job of those who are, kind of most directly involved in policing to constantly examine this data. They need to have this data. They need to be processing it. They need to be tracking it. And I would argue they should be publishing reports, right? Every year, the way we get a school committee report about the schools, we need to get a report about public safety in which the police and the select board interpret for us these numbers and help us understand what they are. We noticed a lot of ups and downs. Unfortunately, we have no way of understanding what drove those ups and downs. And again, I'm a teacher. And one of the things I do is I collect my grade point average, right? I look at my average grade point average. Like I'm not doing any fancy statistical analysis, but I keep watching it. I'm comparing it every semester. Am I giving more A's? Am I giving less A's? Is this a good thing? Is this not? Am I being too easy? Am I being too hard, right? So I don't think this does not claim to be a statistical analysis. The Excel file that we use to do the analysis is available in the public Google Drive. Every one of you can open it and look at the formulae. And the formulae are simple percentages. Literally,
So that is completely true, Smriti. But just to answer Vijay's question, when you look at the sample sizes were absolutely sufficient to say that 40% is different than 7%. I agree we did not do that, but if you were to do that, it is statistical significance just says, are two things different from each other? Are we pretty sure two things are really different from each other and not randomly look like they're different from each other? And the sample sizes were absolutely sufficient to say, yes, it is not due to chance that 20, 30, 40% of whichever metric it is are Black. I can state that as someone who is familiar with data, even though I agree with you, Smriti. I'm just adding that for Vijay's question.
Right. And I'll add one more thing. So we don't have a breakdown of resident and non-resident, but the police did release a little bit of data in response to a question from Nuwari. This was something I wanted to say, so I'm going to say it now. And you won't be surprised that the majority of these are non-resident by Black people of color, right? So I want to address that, head on. I think the worst thing we could do as a town is to say, oh, it's only non-residents. Oh, it's non-residents, so it doesn't matter as much. Both my kids went to kindercare, and you walk into kindercare and it's full of Black and brown women. Their favorite summer camp counselors, right? They're the folks that the sort of essential workers at Sudbury Farms and at Trader Joe's and at the pediatrician's office. These are the non-residents. Marvin Hendry working at the massage parlor to make people's aches and pains go away. These are non-resident Needhamites. And do we really want to say that these numbers don't count? If it's not residents who are being, quote unquote, interacting with the police. So I really want to urge us, to kind of think very carefully, all the talk about essential workers that we've been having, think really carefully about the intersection of class and race here and about, who we welcome into our community and how we welcome them into our community. And those kinds of things, I think the numbers do, kind of transmit our values. And I do want us to not dismiss this as only non-residents. I don't think that should be an appropriate response to this.
Thank you both. I want to bring in Ramin's question, which is about the possible impact of pending or actual litigation that might influence the response of town to all of these various investigations that are going on. As far as I know, there is no actual litigation that has been submitted or started. But yeah, do any folks?
Maybe Stephanie might want to respond to that.
Yeah, I saw Ramin's question, and I think he's right that to the extent that the civil rights suit goes forward, I don't know, I don't have any personal knowledge of Mr. Henry's suit, except that he has retained counsel, that they filed a demand letter with the Needham PD, and they've been in the discovery process. But beyond that, I don't know the next steps in the litigation or whether a complaint has been formally filed. I don't think so, or I think we would all know that. But it's likely to come. I think that they are in the discovery process with a complaint likely down the road. And I think Ramin's point is a good one, that it wouldn't be unusual for the police department to be less willing to admit things that they did wrong in the Henry case, knowing that litigation is likely impending. And that is problematic in terms of, it's unfortunate, but problematic in terms of seeking cooperation from Needham PD in this process. I will say that for all of us Needham residents, we're going to be the ones paying for this litigation. We're going to be paying for the defense team. We're going to be paying for any settlement. So it's really in our interest to encourage productive conversation with Needham PD about reform so that it doesn't keep happening. And not just of course, from a financial perspective, from a justice and fairness perspective.
Yeah. Great. We have another couple questions in the chat here. One is, can the use of ballot questions address any of these issues? I would just add to that question, potentially citizens petitions, which is the way that us civilians can add something to the warrant that will be voted on by town meeting. I don't know if anyone on the call wants to feel that one.
Maybe I'll just quickly mention that one of the great findings here, or suggestions, is that we compare oversight of public safety to oversight of the public schools, and look to establish a civilian oversight of public safety that could include a number of departments, including health and fire, et cetera. But in any event, establishing that is is a process, and obviously would involve a number of different town departments. So yeah, I suppose a worst case scenario would be to try to force something with a citizens petition, but one would hope that the town would embrace this approach and think about establishing such a panel.
Thanks, John. Do we have any other questions from folks? Let me see.
I'm going to just make one more contribution. My understanding with respect to an apology is that, during this legalized process, the town cannot formally apologize directly to Mr. Henry, but would have to do so through his attorneys. But that has not taken place as far as we can tell. So just to clarify that.
Thanks, John. Didn't know that. All right. If that is all for questions.
I have one more question. As a town meeting person, I think it's really important for us all there are so many people doing so much work here, and many of it is volunteer. If there is a way to get out to the town, and of course, this is so much of a bigger issue in all police departments, but of a way that we can concretely, as concerned citizens, find the paths, like John was talking about, having an oversight board, what we can do procedurally, organizationally, who to contact about expediting the procedures rather than just showing our support, which obviously we all have, what we can do, what I can do tomorrow, who I talk to, who I call, what organization do I contact? Actually in town meeting, we do vote on proposals and we have some influence on what is presented to us, but how does one influence what is presented to us? What warrants are initiated, what boards are formed, where we budget for, rather than doing a group that studies the infrastructure of the roads. We do a group that studies the infrastructure of the police department and the training and the hiring possibly of not training police people to necessarily be able to deal with mental issues, but an outside person who works with them, who goes to on the scene with them. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is that I need a 1, 2, 3. What does Carol Urwitz do in my small way to get the ball rolling tangibly?
Carol, I'm going to give a quick response to that. I think for all of us, we've been paddling extremely hard to get to the point of understand. The Tidwell report only came out on Tuesday. Our report is done for a month, but I think there's a couple of things that we can look at here. Number one, we've been trying to get the EJN report to all of town meeting members, and we've been doing that by sending the report to those whose emails we have. But folks can forward that report to other town meeting members so they're aware of this report. And if you can send links, we'll send out more information to this group, and it will be packaged in a way that you could forward. Number two, we may establish essentially a petition in favor of a civilian oversight of public safety. That's going to take a little bit of thought, but that is something that you could sign, do, share, identifying folks as town meeting members, as well as just obviously the most important constituency, the citizens. So that is something that we're working on, and we can get out so that the town sees the large number of people who would support such a panel being established. The other thing that all these folks can do is participate, if you're interested in support these, with EJN. The group is an amazing, talented set of people. It's grown dramatically, but the work ahead of us is very, very significant. So Carol, if you are interested in joining in and you're having your voice added to the planning process, I think it would be really wonderful. I'll turn it over to others, but those are sort of a couple of.
Thank you very much. And that was meant really just as a help me. It was not meant as anything but thank you all for all the hard work you do.
Of course.
Much appreciated.
Another that may interest you, Carol, is that the town is currently in the process of establishing a resilience network, which would be, you mentioned something about like, where do we go? Who do we call if something happens, if we need to respond to something? Right now, it is this sort of like scattered, we're experiencing this right now as we respond to the horrible murders of Asian American folks in Atlanta. And this is something that Needham Diversity Initiative has been doing a really great job spearheading, organizing a vigil. I believe it's Saturday at 2. Someone, looks like nods. So Saturday at 2, there will be a vigil held for that. And we're in the process of getting this resilience network set up, which would feature representatives from organizations, just resident organizations, and then also the police chief would be there and representatives from town government, like the select board. It would be like a group that could respond to a bat signal essentially and mobilize if there is need for community response. So we're really, really excited to see that established, and I think that'll be a great boon for the town.
I wanted to say one thing. I mean, it doesn't directly bear on our report or the data we collected at all, but I think to come back to the question of apologies and so on, I do think apparently one of the officers promised Marvin that they would come to his place of work and apologize to him. And, of course, he was not invited to that select board meeting through his lawyers, or, so he has no idea that an apology was offered. It was not offered to him. But I think I think to ask the select board, and I don't know, maybe the officers as well, to fulfill that promise, I think it's, again, it's a gesture. It's not, but it is a gesture of healing. And it is an important gesture of atonement for those of us who believe in that stuff. So I do think that's one simple thing that I think he has wanted, which, again, it doesn't address the larger structural systemic issues, but it's a small thing that I do think it would be good to ask the select board to do.
I'll just add one quick thing, and this is not, the problem is we're dealing with a political realm, so almost everything's political, but I guess as I listened to the select board's comments on Tuesday, it was just very apparent, at least to me, that if we had different representation in the room, that for the select board and working with the Tidwell team, that paragraph that Noah read would not have been removed. If for no other reason than just out of pure human decency for other people who may identify with other people who have had a similar experience, regardless of the legal litigation, any litigation or liability that might be at stake. And so I do think that new leadership, new voices, engaging in the electoral political process is going to be part of the solution now and in the future.
Great, thank you, everybody. Let's see, are there any final questions? It's 7:50, so it might be time to start to wrap up. How about we all take a collective deep breath? It's a heavy one. This is some real stuff that's going on in our town. I want to thank you all for engaging with it. It's really uncomfortable to look the situation in its face. I would love to believe in a rosier picture of Needham, but what we have is work to do. And it's going to take sustained effort. It's going to take working together. And we're really at the beginning phases. I mean, EJN is not even a year old. We're building off of the work of a lot of these other groups, Progressive Needham, Needham Diversity Initiative. There are so many great groups in town that have been doing this work. But when it comes to really buckling down for some serious change and some accountability and some oversight, it's time to get to work here. So I need to take another deep breath because it's emotional stuff. This is it's very intense. And as much as we want to focus on the data and what's really happening, there is an emotional dimension to this as well. So take care of yourselves. And hopefully we'll see you at some EJN meetings going forward. Let's see, I think, here's the link to our website. I'm sure a lot of you are already on our newsletter. That's our primary way of getting info out to you all. But we have working groups working on public safety. There's a lot more to do. We also have a working group on housing, looking at the current state of affordable housing with the Needham Housing Authority in Needham, and then also changing zoning to kind of get more affordable or a range of housing in Needham. We have Equal Justice in Needham for Families doing amazing work for early childhood education, kind of outside of the school. They do really great events like book readings and stuff like that. VJ is going to be spearheading the start of a new environmental justice working group. We're really excited about that. We're starting to look into schools as well. So there's just a preponderance of work. Did I use that word properly? I think I have it in my head. I got a thumbs up from the law professor, so I think I'm good. There's a lot, and it all intersects. That's why we kind of need to work on all these fronts, because you can't look at any of this in isolation. So thank you all. The recording of this video will be on EJN's website soon, hopefully by the early next week. So definitely, if you know people who weren't able to make it tonight and would like to see what this was all about, we can you can send that along from our website. So thank you all again. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you next time.